Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, The Business Case for LGBTQIA Inclusion in the Workplace, Navigating Policies, Procedures, and Practices. The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law sans the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Susan will discuss the implicit association test, recruitment and retention, heterosexism assumptions, international LGBT considerations, marketing and advertising, restroom access for transgender employees, responding to negative reactions to LGBTQIA inclusion, workplace dress codes, transgender employees, and gender non-conforming employees. To give you a little background about our presenter, Susan Strauss RN is a national and international speaker, trainer, and consultant. Her specialty areas include education and workplace harassment, discrimination and bullying, organization development, and management and leadership development. Susan conducts bullying and harassment investigations, works as an expert witness for education and workplace harassment and bullying lawsuits, and coaches those managers and employees that need assistance in stopping their harassing or bullying behavior. Attending to require a passcode, the word for today is inclusion. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 90 minutes. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archived recording of the webinar. Slides can be downloaded from the resource list at the widget at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all for attending today, and Susan, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Well, thank you and welcome everybody, and I am coming to you from Minnesota, where it is a bit chilly today and overcast. You know, one of the ways that I keep current on what's going on regarding harassment and discrimination is I belong to a number of legal blogs, and one of them I just came in and it said, "Is your workplace prepared to be non-binary?" And I think that's what we're going to be seeing more and more of. So with that, let's go forward, and there's just more of a bio about me if you're interested. And let's look at the objectives. What is it we're going to be discussing in the next 90 minutes? Well, we'll look at the definitions. You know, we've got this acronym up there, LGBTIQA, and we have to remember that acronym actually stands for people. So we will identify what those initials stand for. We'll examine the LGBTQIA perceptions and stereotypes. And to shorten it, I'm only going to be saying LGBT. But more and more, you're going to be hearing it as LGBTQI and sometimes A. We'll look at the business case for LGBT inclusion in the workforce. So not just including them as a diversity element, but what do we do about inclusion? And we'll describe the impact on LGBT employees and the workplace, you know, when they fear being authentic to who they are. We'll also discuss the term transgender and transgender employees. We will examine the need for gender transition guidelines. Every organization should have them, and I'll be giving you some references for that as well. We will also identify some practices to help minimize discrimination. We will discuss the outcome of LGBT supportive policies and practices, and we will examine some individual and organizational strategies that can be used for inclusion of the LGBT population into the work environment. And we'll identify the workplace challenges. And, you know, that's not only for LGBT employees, but also for non-LGBT employees. Now, there is an outline that Lauren had discussed with you earlier, but that is what she had mentioned, and that is some additional information that we will be discussing. One thing that I want to draw your attention to is we will be talking about stereotypes, and stereotypes can be both conscious and unconscious. And we think about those in terms of implicit is unconscious, explicit is conscious. There is the implicit association test. This was designed by researchers at Harvard and the University of Washington. It's been taken by over 20 million people from over 20 countries. And I would just encourage you to take it. It's actually a series of tests. And the tests are timed. They're a challenge. And what they do is they measure your inner beliefs about various factions of society. So, for example, men, women, blacks, Native Americans, the disabled, LGBT, people that are underweight, overweight, etc. Now, all of us have unconscious biases. It's built into our DNA, and it was built in with the idea of protection, because the unconscious bias saves us from having to access conscious portions of our brain, and we can act unconsciously. Now, the test has been tested for validity and reliability, and for the most part, it's been found to be valid and reliable. It's been only recently there have been additional researchers that are beginning to challenge that. Anyway, go take it. See what you find out. You'll be amazed. Now, let's take a look at the terminology, and some of this I'm going to assume that you know, and some you may not. Also, I will be stopping periodically to take a drink of water, just so you know, so you don't think that we've been disconnected. I'm going to make an assumption that you all know what lesbian, gay, and bisexual are. Next is T for transgender. Now, you'll notice I also have transsexual on the slide. Transsexual is an outdated term, but the word trans is considered appropriate. Now, the word transgender is considered an adjective, not a noun. So we would not say somebody is transgender. We'd say that they are a transgender male or a transgender female. Then we have Q for questioning or queer. Now, when we think about Q for questioning, you might think, well, questioning what exactly? Well, it could be that an individual is questioning their sexual orientation, or they may be questioning their gender identity. Then we have Q for queer. Now, for the most part, we've thought about queer historically as a derogatory term that was used to label the LGBT community. But, you know, it's not considered quite so derogatory anymore. While those that are straight should never use it to define the LGBT community, you will find that the LGBT community in and of itself will use that term to define it. They have acquired the term as a self-affirming socio-political label for themselves. And we also hear the term used more. Universities, for example, offer courses in queer studies. Intersex is a term that many people are not aware of. You may have heard it as years ago as hermaphrodite. Intersex is the most common term now, and it can display itself in a number of ways. Intersex generally means that a baby is born with ambiguous external genitalia, so that when you look at that baby, you cannot tell if that baby is male or female. Now, there's another way it can display itself as well, and that is when you may have both testicular and ovarian tissue. And another way might be this one I just learned about. It's where a baby is assigned a sex at birth, and that's the way we phrase it, by the way. So all of us today were assigned a sex at birth. And sometimes what happens is the baby develops as the sex assigned at birth until it hits puberty. And then, lo and behold, the opposite sex hormones kick in. So the secondary sex characteristics are of the opposite sex of what the baby was assigned at birth. There's been some research, and they have found that that's due to a gene mutation. It's estimated that approximately every 1,500 to 2,000 babies is born intersex. What I encourage you to do, we're going to talk a little bit more about transgender, but there was about a year ago on National Geographic, a documentary called Gender Revolution, and Katie Couric hosted it, and it's excellent, and it deals with intersex and transgender children and adults. It's very, very good. Now, let me go back to intersex for a minute, and you might think, well, why do I need to hear about this now? Well, I tell you, I think we're going to be hearing more and more about it. We are finding that some adults who were assigned sex at birth, even though they were intersex, are not happy about that. And for the first time last year, we had one woman who found she was intersex, legally went in and changed her birth certificate from female to intersex. Since then, we have had several others, and we're going to be hearing more about that. I was in a school the other day doing training, and the school nurse told me that there are many students in the school who have come forward and claimed that they are intersex. So we'll be hearing more about it. For the first time in the world, we had a baby born in Canada, and the mother did not assign a sex to the baby and has indicated that that baby, as it grows, can determine its own sex. Now, A could be ally, which I'm hoping that all of you that have signed up for today are allies. It could also stand for androgyny, and it could stand for asexual. So we have a couple of things with A. Gender non-conforming is just that, gender non-conforming. That person is not a transgender individual. I'll give you an example. One of the cases that I worked on as an expert witness involved a young woman who identified as female. She identified as a lesbian, but she was definitely gender nonconforming. To look at her, you would have sworn she was a male. Her mannerisms were masculine. Her style of dress was masculine, but she identified as female. Now, LGBT or LBGT is an umbrella term. Gender expression is how each of us express our gender. And I think for the most part, women have more freedom in how to express their gender. You know, we can wear pants, we can wear skirts, we can wear dresses, we can wear leggings, and while men can certainly dress that way, it's not the usual way that men express their gender. Gender identity refers to the innermost deep belief that you are, in fact, male or female. We all are born with sex, and we all are born with gender. So usually the two of them are aligned, but at times they are not. And the whole idea about what is sex and what is gender is challenging. And the courts have yet to decide whether or not Title VII, in fact, protects LGBT individuals, and we'll get to that in a little bit. And it gets into that the law in 1964 was based on sex discrimination, and it didn't mention gender. Well, I tell you, back in 1964, I was a senior in high school, and I don't remember ever hearing the word gender. I don't know about any of you, but it was just not a term that was discussed. Two-spirit is a term that is used by many Native communities, and they feel that when somebody is intersex or transgender, that they have an advantage because they see the world through two genders. There are some Native tribes that will recognize as many as 5 genders. Asexual, I talked about, and it basically means the absence of having a sexual attraction towards anyone. Pansexual means that you are basically attracted to any sex or any gender. So you are thought of as being sexually fluid. So you might be attracted to an intersex person, a transgender, a male, a female. Polyamorous is referring to individuals that have more than one sexual relationship, but it is with full support and trust of however many partners choose to be engaged with them. Now, it sounds as though it's, sleeping around, but it actually isn't. It's a little bit different than that. Whether we'd hear much about polyamorous in the workplace is a whole other issue. I can't imagine that we'd hear too much about it, but these are some of the most common terms that are used. And I've just given those to you in another way, going around. And let's look at some of the definitions. I've given you the acronym. And again, I just want to remind you that that acronym is representative of real people. There's a large variety of words and definitions. I've only given you a few. There is a dictionary that you can find online that I believe has over 100 words. Facebook lists 60, and it's important for all of us to respect the language choices that individuals within the LGBT community use as theirs. There are variations in preferences, and this can be related to the region that they live in or even the LGBT community in which they belong. So think about that and be familiar with as many as you can. Now, let's take a look at what we're talking about. Some of this you may very well be aware of, and some of it you may not. Not knowing exactly where everybody's at, consider this sort of a 101 slide. Sexual orientation is a spectrum. And if you remember back to some of your college classes, we were taught that none of us is strictly heterosexual or strictly homosexual, but that we all fall on a continuum. The biological or physical sex is referring to the sex assigned at birth, which of course hormones, chromosomes, genitals, reproductive organs. Gender is referring to the role that we assume in society. So the role based on gender might vary whether you live in France or Africa, California, Minnesota. It's considered a social construct, and we refer to it then as gender identity. And the gender identity and sexual orientation do not always match. So when we look about sexual orientation, it is a person's permanent romantic and sexual feelings towards another person. All right, it's the gender identity that refers to the sense of identity based on one's identifying as being male or female. So when we think of the term, for example, gay, you know that that's males. But sometimes we use the term gay that can apply to both males and females, depending upon the context or even depending upon the conversation. Bisexual, of course, is people who are attracted to both, and lesbian is generally referred to as females who are attracted to other females. Now, here's a question. What is your sexual orientation? Everyone has one, and everyone has gender identity, and everyone falls on that continuum that is shown on your screen. Now, let's look at a few more. Sexual orientation. This refers to the attraction that we have towards a particular sex. Some people will use sexual preference. You don't want to use that. It's an inappropriate term, and it implies that individuals have a choice, that they choose to be gay, they choose to be lesbian, they choose to be bi. But those of you that are straight, think about it. Did you choose to be straight? Because an individual who's gay will say, hey, I chose to be gay the same day you chose to be straight, because it's not a choice. Okay, now let's look at gender expression and gender identity. Gender expression, again, is a way in which a person communicates their gender for their culture. So it has to do with clothing, communication, patterns of speech, etc. And gender identity is our innermost concept of self as being male or female. Now we'll get into that a little bit more, however. This is the gingerbread person. It's a great little person, and if you take a look, it helps to explain. Identity is in the brain, orientation is the heart, sex is the genitalia, and expression is how we express our sexuality. And if you look over to the right, you will see the continuums and some additional terms, genderqueer, for example. And that's a term that's used for those that are in the middle. They're saying, hey, I might be male, I might be female, I might be both. So we are finding that some transgender individuals will be either transgender male, transgender female, transgender both male and female at the same time, or they might say, I am neither male nor female. Now, think about this in terms of pronouns that you would use. So if somebody is a transgender female, it means the sex that they were assigned at birth was male, and they are now a transgender female because their identity is female. If you're a transgender male, it means the sex you were assigned at birth was female, and your gender identity is male, therefore you are a male. It doesn't make any difference if you've had any hormone therapy or gender affirmation surgery. You don't have to have any treatment to alter your body to be considered a transgender individual. Now, we also know, however, that some transgender people claim to be both male and female. Or they might be male one day and female the next. Your best bet, if you're dealing with clients, for example, who claim to be transgender client, to ask them what pronoun do they want you to refer to them as. So generally speaking, if a transgender individual identifies as both male and female, then they want to be known as they. If a transgender individual does not identify as either male or female, there can be, well, one of the words, and I don't like it, I think it sounds terrible, is it. I think it's just very demeaning. What we see used in Europe and is gaining popularity here in the U.S. is the term Z, meaning that that individual is neither male nor female. But because they may change their gender identity from one day to the next, it's always best to ask what pronoun they want used that day. Then we see that gender expression is there. We talked about androgyny, biological sex, you see intersex, and sexual orientation. So the gingerbread person is a pretty good example of how it all fits together. Now, transgender, as I mentioned, are those individuals who do not identify with the sex that they were assigned at birth. They can start informing their parents as young as the age of 3 that they are not the sex their parents say they are. When we look at the age that children are aware that there are both boys and girls in the world and which one they are, that's generally at about the age of 3. So it's also at the age of 3 that we are hearing more and more children coming out, if you will, to their parents. We know that transgender individuals are much more likely to be discriminated against and harassed in the workplace and, of course, in society as well. Now, I've given you another handout that talks about transgender, and it gives you some of the other words that are commonly used. And, for example, female to male, male to female, you've probably heard of crossdresser, drag queen, and king, and genderqueer. And again, it doesn't mean that they've done any alteration to their bodies. But note that being transgender does not have anything to do with your sexual orientation. One of my new friends, who is a lawyer, she is 60, and she transitioned from male to female at the age of 52. I've learned a lot about this from her. She is a transgender female, and she is also bisexual. She said it's kind of a hoot when she goes to speak to judges and attorneys at conferences, because to see her, she's got long blonde hair and she has her nails done. And I tell you, I'd kill for her legs. She's very attractive, but she gets up to speak and her voice is male. So I was asking her, how come your voice didn't change? Well, when she transitioned, her voice was already male, so you may run into this. Once the voice has become masculine, it cannot be reversed. Now what they have is hormone suppression meds that they can give to a child to hold off puberty until that child is more assured that they are, in fact, a different gender than their sex. And this interferes then with changes that are done to their voice. Okay, now, transsexual, as I mentioned, is an older term, and it's one that you would not want to use. And again, transgender, however, is an adjective, not a noun. Queer, the history of derogatory terminology. And again, it's been reclaimed, though, by the LGBT community. They're proud of it. For those that are heterosexuals that are on today, it would not be appropriate, however, for us to refer to anyone within that population as queer. Now, questioning, as I mentioned, these are folks that are exploring their sexual orientation, their gender identity. They are not sure, and they're a little concerned about actually having a label because of the fear of discrimination. So we still have people that come out of the closet or not. And this, of course, as you well know, is a person who has self-identified as somebody within the LGBT community, but has not come out that way. I'm going to let you read this slide. I'm not going to discuss it. Just take a look at it. This comes from a group in California called Out and Equal. And if you are interested in taking some additional webinars that deal more specifically and more in depth than this one on the LGBT community, I would encourage you to access the Out and Equal website, and I'll be giving that to you in a little bit. And as you can see here, there are a number of other terms that might be used for the LGBT population. I'm not going to go through all of them because you can read through them, but it is something else for you to consider. Now, the size of the LGBT population, I think there might be some changes to this. This was a study that was done in 2011, so it's a bit outdated, but I've not seen anything more current. And here, of course, you can see that there's approximately 9 million Americans, that would be about the size of New Jersey, that identify as LGBT. But if you take a look, it says here that it's estimated that only 0.3% of adults are transgender. I question that, and one of the reasons I'm questioning that is currently a colleague and I are doing some qualitative research on common practices on how K through 12 prevent and intervene on both bullying and harassment of, well, not just LGBT, but others as well. And what I have found is even in rural communities, small towns, they have transgender students. So I think with the freedom now of people to feel that they can be out, that if we were to do another study, we'd find that many more people than 0.3% would identify as transgender individuals. Now, if you're dealing with people of color, they are up against a double whammy. And they're up against a double whammy because of their race and ethnicity as well as being within the LGBT population. So those two together then can create what we might call intersectionality, and where there's an intersect of discrimination against them because they are LGBT and because of their race and ethnicity. In fact, we know that LGBT workers of color are discriminated even more. One thing that's interesting, though, is that 1/3 of the LGBT population are people of color. That's pretty good. They're more racially diverse than the general population. Of course, it would make sense because of discrimination and harassment that they don't get the same pay and benefits. They are discriminated more. They're more likely to be unemployed, a higher risk of poverty. And when we think about those that are trans employees, they have 4 times more unemployment than those that are not. I've given you something to read after today's webinar. It's written by Dennis Sanders, and I think it's an outstanding treatise about being gay as well as being black. So I wanted you to have that. Now let's talk about heterosexism. Excuse me. What we need to look at on heterosexism is to recognize that this is actually a system of oppression, because heterosexism believes that anyone that is not straight is not so-called normal. So it's based on homophobia and transphobia. And there's 3 general components to it. One, those of us that are on today, we probably assume, although that's beginning to change, that people that we interact with are in fact straight, that they are heterosexual. Whether that's our client, whether it's a judge, whether it's another attorney, whether it's people in our law offices, it doesn't matter, we assume. And a second component is that there is discrimination and prejudice against anybody who is not heterosexual, because heterosexual, as I mentioned, is seen as normal. And the third component is that there is a systemic display in our institutions, in our laws, in our policies, and we exclude what the needs might be of LGBT employees. What do they need that those that are straight may not need? Now, heterosexism gets explained this way. I'm not sure if you can read your slide very well. I cannot read mine particularly well. I'm going to let you go through and read rather than me going through each one. I'm going to give you a minute and read through these examples of heterosexism. all right? It gives you an idea, and we all do this. We all are caught up in heterosexism because that is our society. And that translates then into heterosexual privilege. And this is privilege that society gives to those that are straight, that it does not give to those that are not straight, and we would refer to that as privilege. So again, I'm going to show you, and I'll let you read through the screen, these are examples of heterosexual privilege. So go ahead and read through these. Now, some of these things are changing. Partially depends on what state you live in. However, when we look at health care, the Affordable Care Act, Section 1557, for the first time, it is giving rights to the LGBTIQ patient, because healthcare providers discriminate and treat those that are LGBT more abusively. They blame them. They are not professional with them. And also, according to the ACA, years ago, if you were a transgender individual, like the woman lawyer I told you about, she had to pay for all of her treatment out of her pocket. Now, like she said, she was a lawyer. She made good money. She did anyway. And she paid for it all. Now, according to the Affordable Care Act, it has to be paid for any kind of transition care that a transgender individual gets. So what about being non-LGBT? So I want those of you that are not within the LGBT framework to read through these and think about how might this fit with you, and how many times have you in fact thought these things, or have you heard your colleagues say them? So again, go through and look at the assessment. So if in fact you are hearing these comments at work, you have a responsibility, particularly if in your role as attorneys you may be in HR or you are in management, you need to confront them. All right? Because this would be discriminatory behavior. So are any of you an ally or an advocate? I would hope that you are, and that's why you're taking the webinar. So an ally then and an advocate is anyone who is heterosexual but takes action to support the LGBT community socially and within their workplaces. So how can you be an ally anyway? Now, some of this, it might seem pretty typical, but watch what language you use. And as much as you can, be non-gender specific and by not assuming somebody's gender identity. And recognize that people can have different types of gender expression. Speak out when you hear people making derogatory comments about those that are in the LGBT population. And get involved with causes and organizations. For example, I know here in the Twin Cities, we have almost like a Pride weekend, not just a Pride parade. And all sorts of organizations are sponsors to that, whether it's the police department, whether it's Medtronic, it doesn't matter on the size, but the different companies will create floats, they donate money to the cause. So think about what you can do. There's the men's gay choir. have them come in and present in your organization. But support them in whatever way you can, socially and within the organization. So you want to gain awareness. So ask yourself, how different and how similar are you from anybody that might be gay, lesbian, bisexual, transgender, or questioning? And how are you going to gain this awareness? Well, for one thing, you take a webinar like this. You might contact Out and Equal. They've got a number of webinars, and they have people. I took theirs and got certified. They have people from other countries that sign on to their webinars as well, so you can learn what's going on in other countries. And do as much reading as you can. Attend workshops. Become part of the LGBT community. Examine yourself. Where are your biases? And then I don't know if you remember the It Gets Better project, but this is a project that came on the internet, and it was primarily enacted to support the LGBT student population when they were being harassed at school. Now, here's another thing. Watch what terms you use. This just tries me when, especially when I'm doing training or working as an expert witness, when the workplace or the school will refer to discrimination as bullying, and they are not the same. And it is important, I think, to use the correct terminology. Bullying, whether it's in the workplace or in the school, gets minimized, whereas when somebody hears the word discrimination or harassment, they automatically put more weight on it. So I think that calling it what it is critical rather than bullying. So think about it. You are gaining awareness now, and I would guess that many of you already have some awareness, and this might have been a good way to get some continuing legal education. I'm guessing that many of you are already allies, and an advocate is considered somebody that goes above and beyond what an ally does. So think about where you're at and where you'd like to be. So these are some things that you can do to reduce the prejudice and discrimination at work. So I would encourage you to look at this a couple of ways. And, of course, I'm not sure what legal specialties you all are in, but I think that this fits for your law practice, but it also fits if you are doing any consulting with clients, particularly if you are an employment lawyer. So I think it's important to examine in your firm any sorts of anti-gay stereotypes that you may overhear, and to think, is this the way that we want to treat others? Make a point of getting to know LGBT folks in your law firm or with your client base who are open about it. Of course, you need to respect them. Engage in conversations with them. Share who you are and encourage them to share who they are. And work as much as you can with communities as well as individuals to combat prejudice and discrimination, not only your own, for example, but those that might exist in your law firm or in your client's law firm. Let's look at questions that you might have so far. Lauren, are we ready for any questions?
Yes, we are now entering the Q&A session. Please enter the passcode, which is inclusion. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must attend for the full 90 minutes of the presentation. Also, enter any questions that you have. First question we have, you mentioned everyone has a sexual preference. What if you are asexual and you have no preference?
Well, first of all, just a reminder, the word is not preference, it's orientation, because preference denotes that it's a choice. So we all have a sexual preference, even if your sexual preference, or not preference, you got me caught in a sexual orientation, even in fact, if you are asexual. Your sexual orientation identifies who you are attracted to and who you who turns you on, basically. But you can have your sexual orientation as asexual. It's just another form of sexual orientation. Good question. Keep in mind orientation, not preference.
Next question. Can queer be used to imply genderqueer?
Yeah, queer is another term for genderqueer, although, to be honest with you, queer is usually used in a more broad connotation, which is referring to LGBTQI. And when we see genderqueer, that is sometimes referring just to whether you are male or female. But, you know, some of it depends on what part of the country you're from. It might depend on the LGBT community in which you reside. I know some of the classes that are taught, and even if you're doing any reading in your professional journals or professional magazines, you might see genderqueer and queer used interchangeably. Generally speaking, queer is a broader term, but it may not necessarily be, and genderqueer is a little bit more restrictive.
Next question. Are there any studies that correlate bias or discrimination or harassment with the attractiveness of an LGBT? That is, the more attractive the individual, the less the discrimination?
I'm not aware of any studies on that, but that said, it doesn't mean that there haven't been. I think the issue with discrimination and harassment is that discrimination and harassment is based on the abuse of power, and it's not based on sexual attraction. Even with the 1998 Supreme Court ruling of Oncal versus Sundowner, the U.S. Supreme Court dictated that sex harassment, sex discrimination doesn't have anything to do with sexual attraction, but it has to do with power. So if, in fact, somebody is attractive, may not have anything to do with whether they are, in fact, discriminated or harassed. It really is due to the abuse of power rather than the attractiveness of the individual, generally speaking. And I'm not aware of any specific study that you are inquiring about.
Last question for now. Can you differentiate more between being an intersex and a hermaphrodite individual?
They're the same, actually. Hermaphrodite is just the older term. I have a nursing background, and I know when I was in nursing school, we learned the word hermaphrodite. And at that point, they said that it was so rare that they doubted if we would ever see it. Well, when I was a student nurse, lo and behold, we had a baby born that today would be referred to as intersex. And when we looked at that baby's genitalia, you could not tell if that baby was male or female. Now, what they did back then is, well, let me backtrack. First of all, when you're developing in utero, everybody develops pretty much as female, and then the male hormones kick in and cause the transition of the genitalia to be male. Now, back in my day, what they did when they could not tell is they would take cells from the inside of the cheek, and they would examine the cells and look at the chromosomes to determine if the baby chromosomally was male or female. Based on that, the parents would then give approval for the provider to gently, quote-unquote, treat the baby with whatever hormone aligned with the chromosome. And that's what was done. Now, what they do, at least this was according to the documentary on the gender revolution, is they've got a measuring device. And when the baby is born and they can't determine the sex, they use this measuring device to measure the phallus. Now, if the phallus is short, they will say, this must be the clitoris. It's going to be a girl. If the phallus is a little larger than the mean, then then they say, well, this is a little larger, so this will be a penis, it'll be a boy. Seems a bit loosey-goosey to me. It didn't say anything about checking chromosomes. However, we also know that you can't always go by chromosomes. People have chromosomes and end up with different conditions. Turner syndrome, for example. There was just recently a woman in her 30s, and she and her husband could not get pregnant. They both went through all the infertility tests, and on a fluke, the doc said, well, let's just check your chromosomes. And what they found is here she was a woman, but she had XY chromosomes, which is for male. So that may not be the best way to do it either. This might be more information than what you wanted, but that is about all I know on intersex. So with that, I'm going to keep going. This gives you the business case for the LGBT inclusive workplace. Now, we're not talking about just diversity. We're talking about inclusivity. One way that I like to confirm the difference between diversity and inclusion is diversity is a salad bar. Inclusion is the salad. I thought that was a good description. So let's look at this. Obviously, if you do truly have an LGBT inclusive workplace, you are going to see that there's more productivity, satisfaction, and morale. And particularly now with the millennials, you are going to be more likely to have an easier time recruiting them and retaining them. There obviously will be less possibility for liability. It's going to increase engagement. And what it does is it communicates not only to your employees, but to your community that you are committed about learning about and including different cultures in your work environment. Because LGBT is a culture, okay? Now, let's take a look at a little bit more. We found that productivity increased as much as 30%, and retention costs had decreased because more people were remaining in the workforce. Here's one for you. I just read a study, it's only one study, that indicated that millennials, and these are I was going to say kids. How's that for age discrimination? Shows you how old I am. These are young people in their 20s and 30s that roughly 20% of them claim to be non-binary. In other words, 20% claim that they are neither male nor female. That's a high bunch. So we're going to be seeing more. I know my grandson, last year, he was 12 and he was in school, and they had a young boy that came out, well, a girl named Sarah who came out as Jack in front of her whole class. And when I asked my grandson about it and if he had any questions, he said, "No, Grandma, that's cool." Now, I think we're going to see, he's in the Gen Z, and some of the Gen Zs now are entering the workplace. The millennials and the Gen Zs, I think, are going to demand that organizations are more inclusive. And when we include the LGBT community, as the green bullet displays, it demonstrates that you are willing to look at diverse opinions in solving problems. It also is going to pull in a more diverse client base for you and for your clients for business development. And hopefully having inclusion of LGBT is going to be in alignment with what your law firm's mission, vision, values, and purpose are. And it also will give leadership visibility to all of you. Now, if you remember, I said that the LGBT community is its own culture. So we should look at cultural competence then. And I'm going to let you read the slide while I take a drink. We tend to think of cultural competence as it relates, primarily probably to race or ethnicity, and we don't always think about it beyond that. But we do need to think about it with the LGBT community. We should acknowledge that they are their own culture. And just as with law firms, for example, or lawyers, I mean, let's face it, you've got your own culture, right? There's a lot of differences within your culture, and there are differences within the LGBT culture. So we also know that no matter what organization that you are doing business with, that there are going to be some who have both real and perceived homophobia and transphobia. I think particularly transphobia, and that will impact how they perceive looking at diversity and inclusion elements in the workplace. So cultural competency will require providing a welcoming environment, and of course, not only to the LGBT population, but to everybody. And it will be important for the employer, whether that's your law firm or your clients, to actually explore on a individual personal level, but also as an organization. Does the organization reflect homophobia, transphobia, and heterosexism? And I can just about guarantee that it does reflect heterosexism. So what do you do? How do you get started in making some changes here? Well, first of all, grab your policies and get anyone that is within your employ, that's within your organization, that is LGBT, to review with you your policies and your processes and look for some of those micro inequities that are present that reinforce heterosexism, that those of you that are straight might not even see because you are straight, whereas somebody who's LGBT would see. Leverage an employee resource group specifically for LGBT employees. We'll talk more about that. Make sure that you've got a champion in the C-suite, a committed leader who will sponsor a very active culture change to ensure that there is inclusion of the LGBT population. And then, as I mentioned before, you've got to design a strategic plan. What are we going to do to make our environment more inclusive? Now, actually, you need to make it inclusive of a number of different communities, but today is just LGBT. So what will be your mission for your strategic plan? What will be the vision? What will be your goals and your measurable objectives? Try to get people involved that are even not particularly all jazzed up about this. You get them involved, and that's going to be important because they will be able to view it from the naysayer's perspective. And you want that perspective because it's going to tell you what you can do to be more effective and successful. Then use whatever resources that you know of in the community even to support LGBT inclusion. Contact some of your competitors and find out what they're doing. Contact other law firms. Contact other employers that you know are active. And think about how often you will, in fact, review and edit your policies and procedures. Think about your training. Think about posters that are up in your office. Do they only demonstrate heterosexual relationships? When you're doing training, are you only speaking in terms of assuming that everybody in the audience is straight? These are things that those of us that are heterosexual don't always even think twice about. We just do it because we're straight. Well, we need to realign that thinking. So when you are starting then, think about what outcomes do you want, and that's going to determine your goals and your objectives. Now, I mentioned earlier that you should grab your already existing policies and review them to ensure that they are not demonstrating heterosexism and that there are no micro inequities towards the LGBT population. You may find that you will actually have to develop some additional policies. And then think about an executive sponsor. What should that person's role be? Define that. Have a little mini job description for that person. And this is an opportunity for grassroots development within your firm or within, if you're working with any of your clients. And you get to learn then from what other internal departments and processes might do to work together on the inclusion effort. So let's take a look at what the definition of inclusion means. I'll let you read this. So diversity is not enough. Remember, you need the full salad. You need to diminish as much as possible the implicit and explicit barriers. Now, this tells you why. Why do you want to do this? Well, as I mentioned before, legally, it's one reason. The LGBT folks are sometimes referred to as the invisible minorities because they've not come out. So if you have those that are in the population, if they feel safe in coming out, they can be role models for clients and for others within the organization. One thing that the LGBT folks will say is that they're never sure if they're safe in talking about their partner, for example, or if you are at a, say, company holiday party, is it okay to bring your same-sex partner to show any affection, such as holding hands or dancing? So they say that they are always having to read between the lines to determine the trust level of individuals and of the organization. They feel that there's not a support system for them and that there's not much opportunity for professional development. And, you know, it also affects the non-LGBT employees. So I'm going to let you read through this particular slide that, again, talks about best practices for LGBT. So go ahead and read through it. Again, I don't think we always think along these lines. When you are looking, for example, to hire, do you ever go to job fairs that are specific for LGBT people searching for jobs? What about your foundations? Do you give money for the LGBT community? And do you track? And of course, you've got to have people that are willing to disclose how many LGBT employees that you have. And what about vendors and procurement? So you get an idea that there's a lot you can do. Make this public, by the way, within the organization, because this demonstrates to all of your employees that you are actively engaged in inclusion of this population. Now, one of the things I had mentioned before was to have an LGBT employee resource group. And I'm not sure how familiar you are with this, but employee resource groups emerged back in about 1990. And what they do is they provide visibility, and in this case, to LGBT inclusion. Now, companies have a lot of different resource groups. Some have women in management, some have the disabled, there's many. But this would just be for your LGBT. And your resource group would focus on the retention of employees, they would give visibility to the LGBT inclusion. And what they would be able to do is to be a voice to senior leadership so that they could give guidance and input on these policies and on practices. They would be able to give a sense of safety and acceptance that could span throughout the organization. And it would establish that LGBT employees are respected and that those in senior leadership want to learn from them, and that by learning from them, that it can, in fact, be a catalyst for culture change. Now, there's the HRC Corporate Equity Index. HRC stands for the Human Rights, I always forget what that C is. I want to say coalition. And they have a corporate equity index. And you can see that it started, 15 years ago? Oh, we're 2018, aren't we? So 16 years ago. And you get a rating. And the rating is based on your policies, your training, your benefits. You look at both sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression, same-sex partners, whether you've got a resource group and a diversity council, if you're engaged in your community, etc. And what you can get then is you get a rating. You would want that rating, and you would want to post it on your website. You would want to post it on any Facebook pages that you have. You would want to post it on anything with LinkedIn because it's advertising where you're at. So think about those that are LGBT. When we that are straight talk about our life, we have conversations about our spouses and our kids without really giving any thought to whether or not we have to keep anything a secret because of our sexual orientation or gender identity. So you want to open that up and make people free to do that. And think about those that are not LGBT and how this affects them. Now, you notice here it says there's 4 generations in the workforce, but you know what? I think we're up to 5 now because baby boomers are not necessarily retiring like they did, and we've got the Gen Zs that are just entering. And as I mentioned before, because LGBT people are seen as invisible, it can negatively impact those that are not. And again, they're looking for role models. They're wanting to look for levels of trust. And they know now, it is getting better, that the support for LGBT employees is certainly getting better, but it's not where it needs to be. So when you're thinking about devising your strategy, again, look at heterosexism. The other thing that can be a challenge is recognizing that some religious beliefs are not going to necessarily like that you're doing this. But you have to ensure, of course, that your LGBT community is not discriminated against. You will end up having some that have a real fear and are transphobic and homophobic, and they may deal with their fear and their anger by lashing out or by telling jokes or making threats, which of course can become a hostile work environment. And the other thing I want you to look at is the lavender ceiling. We've heard of the glass ceiling, but think of the lavender ceiling. And what is it? Well, this is when we don't even consider LGBT community in our workplaces. We don't talk about it. We don't talk about it as individuals. We don't talk about it as an organization. Consequently, it's as though LGBT colleagues don't even exist. It shows a lack of respect for who they are as authentic people. And we don't always remember that they might need some specific coaching and mentoring for their own career development and for promotions. You don't want to impede it. You don't want to prevent it. But this can sometimes be under micro inequities. And this gives you an idea, I'll let you read the slide again, about some examples of micro inequities. Some of this has changed a bit. Let's see. Oh, the second to the last bullet, it says gay lifestyle. That is a micro inequity. Sexual preference, homosexual agenda, family values, all of those are. Now, the last one says request to support Boy Scout events. The Boy Scouts, in fact, I should delete that bullet. The Boy Scouts now have gotten accepting of the LGBT community. So they have changed. They even let girls in. So one of the questions that comes up is LGBT harassment protected under Title VII? And that, of course, is a big question right now. First of all, the EEOC does protect LGBTQI, and they will also say that there is such a thing as associational discrimination. Now, this is based on the EEOC. Now, associational discrimination came about as a result of the ADA, in that it was considered discrimination if you discriminated against an employee because they had a caregiver responsibility of a disabled spouse, parent, or child. And it was referred to as associational discrimination. Well, the EEOC has said that that kind of discrimination needs to occur for all protected classes, including the LGBT. Now, that's what the EEOC says. To my knowledge, that has not been tested in court. So what that would mean is, let's say that you might be married to a transgender male or transgender female. Nobody could, according to associational discrimination then, discriminate against you because of your association with a transgender individual. Now, we might say that if an LGBT individual is discriminated against, wouldn't that be illegal? Wouldn't that be a violation of Title VII? Well, Jeff Sessions, our Attorney General, has said no, but the courts are confused about this. We have some federal courts that are saying, yes, you are protected under Title VII for sex discrimination and sexual harassment, and some are saying, no, you are not. 23 states protect lesbian, gay, and bisexual employees. 19 states protect transgender employees. Now, recently, this last summer, we had 2 federal judges that opined that if you are a transgender employee, you would in fact be protected under the ADA because you have a diagnosis of gender dysphoria. There have been LGBT employees who have sued under Title VII with sex stereotype. There's also a federal law, ENDA, which has been in Washington for a while, and it has not even had a hearing, and I can assure all of you, as you well know, it's not going to have a hearing anytime soon. And then the Office of Federal Contract Compliance Programs, while they've come out to say that they don't want any discrimination, they are actually holding back in clearly indicating that GLBT is protected under Title VII until the court's decisions are not as confusing and fragmented. So we don't really have an answer to that. It depends on what district you're in, etc. So the bathroom issue comes up. And EEOC and OSHA both say you've got to allow people to use the bathroom and the locker room that corresponds to their gender identity, and they cannot be prohibited from using the bathroom that's designated for a certain gender. This has come up in the courts for both schools and the workplace, and generally speaking, they use the bathroom that aligns with their gender. So this, I need to update this. This tells you the states for gender identity and sexual orientation anti-discrimination laws. That is an error. It's gone up one to 23 and 19, and this same as well. It's gone up to 19 states. And some of the state laws can vary somewhat, but be aware that those state laws do exist. Dress codes. Be careful of dress codes. Avoid any of your gender stereotypes and be sure you apply it consistently, whether it is somebody in the C-suite or a maintenance worker. Transgender employees definitely can dress in whichever way it aligns with their gender identity. Be careful about requiring men to wear suits and women to wear skirts. It is legal, but it is based on a gender stereotype, and you probably would not be well liked if you did that. Now, there might be times, perhaps, if you are arguing a case in court or in front of a Supreme Court where you may have some different ideas about that. I'm not a lawyer, so that would be up to you, but you're going to have to be careful with the dress codes. Think about makeup as well. Will there be any differences regarding makeup? Anyway, you get the idea. You can legally implement gender-specific dress codes, but you've got to be careful that they're not arbitrarily enforced in favor of one gender over another. So sometimes you just say in your dress code that you require professional, appropriate dress to the office, and that can get you through it. Now, let's look at buying power for the LGBT population. Now, in 2013, and I've not read a more recent one, but look at that, $830 billion. And remember that they are a more diverse ethnically than the general population, and they're more diverse in terms of socioeconomic status. They're also known to be incredibly loyal. And again, remember that they have a higher incidence of bias and economic disparity. So this woman is an attorney, and she was only representing those that were transgender because she's transgender. She has now left private practice, and she is the executive director of, I don't remember exactly what particular LGBT association, but she is. So she talks about gender transition guidelines. I'm not going to review all of this with you. This is something that you can review after the webinar, but I did want to draw your attention to the three footnotes below. The first one is from Out and Equal, and it actually gives you in-depth guidelines on gender transition. The second one gives you a sample, and this one was done by Chevron, and the third one was done by Ernst & Young, so that you can see what they look like, because they're going to be important for you to use when you've got somebody transitioning. Remember, when you market and advertise, that you want to be inclusive and diverse and sensitive to stereotypes. You don't want to use anything that's going to be perceived as threatening or humor. Go national, go international, do good market research, and specifically market to the LGBT consumer. We know that there's LGBT media and there's events. Think about how your messages portray the LGBT consumer. This will demonstrate your law firms and your clients' depth of understanding as well as their commitment to the LGBT consumer. This, and because of time, I'm not going to go over this, but this just talks to you about avoiding stereotypes and cliches in your marketing and advertising. And again, if you've got an employee resource group, I think they can be pivotal in helping you with this. the purchasing habits of both straight and LGBT adults is that, it doesn't matter to them. They were not more or less likely to purchase items that also were advertised to the LGBT community. So think about that. Now, this slide, and again, I'm not going to go over it just because we've got a short amount of time, but it does tell you some ways that you can address any legislative activity, or not even legislative, quite frankly, but your inclusion activity with those employees that are not in favor of it. And this you can read on your own. Now, internationally, again, Out and Equal provides a very good resource guide for you, and I've given you some other resources here. And this, I'm talking about Out and Equal, this is what they tell you that should be your focus areas. I've got this slide out of place, but and they will get into each of these in more detail. We did talk about them to some degree today. You can get more information about it if you take some additional webinars from Out and Equal. What you would want to consider if you are going to be doing any hiring is be aware of what's going on within that country regarding the LGBT population, because in some countries it's a capital offense if in fact you are LGBT. So only 40 countries, which represent less than 20% of the world's adult population, think that men can have sex. The rest, they don't agree with it. So you want to be sure that you check on that. This particular map is reflected by color as to where you will see more open laws of LGBT individuals compared to other countries. So I think this will be helpful for you. This is a little bit more about the ENDA Act that I talked to you about. That would be in Congress, which I just figure we might all be dead if it ever comes to a hearing. Now, since 2015, we've had a 28% increase in LGBT discrimination. And look at that, 51% increase in monetary awards. So it's increasing. Transgender rights for the bathroom, we talked about that. And I've given you some additional resources that deal with recruiting LGBT employees. And, that C for human rights was not coalition, it was campaign. So I think you'll find these very helpful. And I've also provided you with a glossary of terms that likewise I think will be very helpful. So with that, let's open it up to some additional questions. Okay, Lauren?
Thank you. We are now entering the Q&A session. Please enter the passcode, which is inclusion. Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must have attended for the full 90 minutes of the presentation. First question we have. Many small businesses don't have a human resources department and other resources available to larger corporations. What type of inclusion practices would you recommend as particularly helpful for small businesses?
Well, I think that what I would recommend when they have no HR, and even if they do have HR is not necessarily always well-versed either on inclusion. So what I would recommend is that they hire a consultant that can help them strategize, particularly being a small organization, as to what they can do to have a diverse and an inclusive organization. Unless somebody that works there wants to do some of their own research, I mean, you can, there's books out on it. They could Google it, and they could just give that responsibility to someone who's committed to the issue internally. I've seen that happen, and it's been effective. You've got to make sure that there's money for it, so you've got to have support from on high with your CEO that they will say, hey, I'm willing for one of my internal employees to take this on as a responsibility in addition to their own job. So it would be on the side. That can work. Or you hire somebody to come in and strategize with a small task force within the company as to creating a mission and a strategic plan.
Should we be using LGBTQ or LGBT in policies?
That, first of all, it's just quicker to say LGBT, but what you're seeing more and more is the inclusion of the word Q, and even I. So LGBTQI, I'm seeing that more and more in print. LGBT has become sort of the umbrella acronym, and like doing this today, I shortened it to LGBT. When I'm doing a face-to-face kind of training, I typically continue to use LGBTQI. So part of it is a judgment call on your part. And in what context will you be using the acronym? Today, for example, because I used it so frequently, it was a way to shorten it. But if you're only going to be using the acronym a couple of times, I would include the Q and the I.
Do you have any inclusion tips specifically for managers of blue-collar workplaces?
Okay, did I understand, Lauren? Did you say, are there any inclusion tests? Was that the right word?
Inclusion tips.
Oh, tips. Okay. Well, basically, yeah, when you're a manager, you need to, hopefully there's a strategy, but you need to be totally aware of LGBT, and I think we talked about it in the beginning in terms of confronting any stereotypical comments that are being made, working on policies that may have some micro inequities. We had a couple of slides that showed micro inequities. It would be a manager's responsibility to ensure that those are not occurring, that the manager would be on the lookout for both him or herself's heterosexism as well as evidence of heterosexism within their direct reports. Then the manager needs to have the expertise of how do you intervene when you hear somebody making inappropriate comments, jokes, gestures, micro inequities, and how as an organization do you prevent any kind of discrimination and harassment, and that would be under your strategic plan. So if you go back to some of those earlier slides, I think you will find a number of tips based on the micro inequities, etc., and hopefully managers know how to intervene and tell people that that is a violation of the policy and it's not the kind of work environment that we, in fact, support here at XYZ law firm or XYZ company.
This is our last question. Is there an appropriate way to learn which of your employees identifies as which category?
No, the only thing you can do is you can ask. You can do it on a survey and make sure, though, that you would end up indicating that that is totally a choice as to whether they want to respond or not. You cannot require them to identify if they're straight or GLBT, but if you're doing any kind of a survey, that might be something that you ask. Again, letting them know that they do not need to respond.
Any unanswered questions will be sent to Susan after the webinar to respond to directly. Thank you for answering those questions. Please remember
My pleasure.
Please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must have attended for the full 90 minutes of the presentation. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. In addition to being your best source for testifying and consulting experts for the past 60 years, TASA also offers free interactive webinars, expert written articles, and research reports on expert witnesses such as Challenge History Report 2.0 and Expert Profile 360. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Susan Strauss for her time and effort in creating this presentation. If you would like to speak with Susan, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case that you are working on, please contact TASA 1-800-523-2319. One of my colleagues will be following up with you regarding your feedback on today's presentation. This concludes our program for today.
And thank you so much, everybody. Bye-bye.